All right. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining to our second community connection of 2026. If this is your first time joining, welcome. This is a forum dedicated to the Teams Phone community. And if you joined us last time, welcome back. So our format is a fireside chat podcast style conversation where we are talking directly with the people who build and support Teams Phone every day. A couple of reminders, as you see here, this event is being recorded and it will be shared publicly after on YouTube. So please be aware of that. Any of the questions that you put in the chat are visible to everybody else here. And so please be mindful when you're writing in the chat. My name is Emily, and I'll be leading today's conversation. I am joined by my team. I have Wendy, Mariana, Margie, and our special guest, Jamie Stark, who is here to talk about emergency services. I'm going to take control of the slides here and move us forward. So as I mentioned, we're diving into emergency services. This is a topic that is critical for every organization, frankly, that is using Teams Phone. And it's one of those features that you hope you never have to use, but if you do, it's really critical that it is set up the right way so that it will work. We're going to break it down, go into a bit about what admins need to know, some of the common pitfalls, and some of the background on how the feature was built and why it was built that way. And I'll mention again the two guests we have. It is our very own Mariana, who is the product manager, and Jamie Stark on our service side. So I'll let you two give a quick introduction and then we can jump right in.
Gonna go ahead, Jamie.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark.
Were you waiting for me? Yeah,
hey,
go
everybody. Hey, everybody. My name's Jamie Stark. I have been looking after some of the backend services for Teams Phone for the last couple years. Prior to that, did some engineering work in the Teams Admin Center. And then a million years ago, looked after Teams Phone from the marketing organization. So really happy to be here and talk a little bit more about emergency calling. Mar?
I'm Mariana. I go by Mar too, but I'm very happy to be here and to talk to all of you about E911 and emergency services within Teams. I handle a lot of the client side facing UI and UX that deals with emergency services and work really closely with Jamie and our counterparts on the service side to bring this incredibly important functionality to all of you.
Awesome. Let's dig right in. So if someone asked you, what is emergency calling in Teams, how would you explain it? You can go ahead and start us off, Mar.
Sure. I'd say that emergency calling in Teams is definitely a system, a very important critical system that detects a user's location depending on where you are in the world, in order to provide emergency services for people who are at home, at a remote location, or in the office. And it's very important and critical. There are a lot of regulations around it, especially in the US, that IT admins have to set up and configure. And so this is a regulation that we have to abide by. Jamie, do you have anything else to add?
I think you nailed it. The one thing that I'll highlight though is that, clearly this requires a lot of flexibility, because there's differences in requirements, from a national level, and then even, within the United States, there's different requirements, based on what state or what county you're in. And then for a lot of our customers, they're global multinationals. And so they need to be thinking about not only how emergency services are going to work in these different regions, but also be thinking about how their employees and their users are transiting amongst those regions as well. And the goal to have a consistent emergency calling experience across all of those scenarios is really critical. And I think that's one of the things that we'll get an opportunity to talk about here.
That's a great overview. Thank you both. Clearly, it's a lot more than just a phone call. You're going in through Teams, through the Calls app, but there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes. Jamie, could you talk a bit about what has to go right for that emergency call to work?
Yeah, no, so it's interesting. There's a set of work that Microsoft does on the services side to ensure that customers have the ability to make emergency calls all the time. And so one of the things that we do there is we ensure that when you're assigning a phone number to an end user, that phone number, if it's using our calling plan service, has to have an emergency address associated with it. So regardless of the scenario, there's this kind of fallback sort of mechanism. But that being said, there's also work that the administrators need to do in order to ensure that the location information actually makes it all the way over to emergency services accurately. And so that goes everything from making sure that the locations that are set up within Teams are set up accurately, all the way to making decisions about how granular you want to make those locations and whether or not you want to take advantage of some of the dynamic emergency calling capabilities that are available that actually uses the information about the network on the corporate side in order to inform where the end user is.
Got it. That's a lot going on in the background. I'm glad and it's exactly why we wanted to have this time to dig in.
Yeah.
So, Mar, so with all of that, there's clearly a lot of considerations that customers have to make when they're setting this up. Um, when you are talking with customers, what are some of the misconceptions that you hear about how emergency calling works in Teams?
Think specifically for end users who aren't aware, people assume that, dialing 911 or their emergency services is going to work exactly like it does on a landline or how it does like on a home phone, for example. And like Jamie was mentioning, admins actually have to set up quite a few different policies in order for, dynamic emergency calling or to configure addresses for it to actually work. And the end user also may need to manually verify their location so that the emergency services get to the location of the user. So it's not like a very hands-off mechanism at all. It's really important that end users are aware, and so we have different UI and UX within the calls app specifically to like alert and let users know that this is important and that they need to take an action for certain things, like verifying your address.
Right. And that's a good point because a lot of the other things that we build with phone, it's, um, you know, kind of the bread and butter. It's very intuitive, but with emergency calling, it has to be a lot more directive, kind of very obvious, so that in those critical times, users know what they have to do and how it works. So that's a really those are really good points. I think regardless though when we're talking about a service and teams in general, people they expect things to work. Clearly, as you're both alluding, there's a lot that has to go on ahead of time to make sure that it does work. So, um, Jamie, when you're talking about some of the admin configurations and decisions that need to be made, what are the risks that if it's not configured correctly, Teams emergency calling won't work?
We, like I said earlier, there's a lot that Microsoft does to ensure that that even in cases of misconfiguration, that calls still proceed through. And so there is this kind of fundamental baseline that's available. But some of the risks are fundamentally that users who dial emergency services are not going to get emergency services showing up to them in the time that's necessary. Like that's the fundamental risk, and ultimately that is a health and safety risk for your end users. And so as for administrators, it's super important to make sure to really be thoughtful about how this works. For example, if you have an organization where you have multiple sites and people transit between those sites, it probably doesn't make sense to use static emergency locations assigned to phone numbers, even though that will ensure that that a call makes it to the emergency services to be able to be dispatched. You may need to have a conversation with the dispatch about, oh, actually, I'm not in my normal office location. Instead, I'm working in a different office, or I'm not where my kind of registered phone number is supposed to be. And that's again, to Mark's point, that's a different model than what we have with kind of copper plain old telephony service, where the physical wire can't really move around. Like the physical wire is attached to the phone number, and that's going to go to your house. And so when you dial emergency services from there, it's going to get routed, and the address that shows up for emergency services is going to be the address where the phone is located. Obviously, with Teams, we have lots of opportunities to take our phone, all around the world, right? And so it's with that lens that we want to ensure that location is provided to emergency services in the most granular way possible, so that way we can ensure folks are getting getting emergency services within the time that they need.
Great. Margie, are you joining in for some questions?
Yeah, we have some questions in the chat. So first one.
So soon. That's great. Sorry, go ahead.
Does Microsoft have a relay center if a user does not have an address associated to them or do not have a remote address set?
I owe something to the astute listener who asked that question, because I was just about to step into the concept of a relay center before in my prior answers. That's perfect. What happens when Teams does not have a great certainty about the location? So there are some times when Teams is super certain about your location, and there's some times that there could be some doubt. And when there is doubt about an end user's location, Microsoft actually will route that call to what's called an emergency response contact center, or ECRC, emergency response contact. I'm going to mess up on the acronym, but the ECRC's job is to have human staff 24/7 to answer that call and to interact with the caller to determine where they are prior to sending that call off to the actual emergency services. The way that emergency services works in the United States is that a public safety access point, or PSAP, is the the area or the component within the emergency services dispatch that knows about fire and ambulance and police, and knows about the way that that those services overlay a particular geographic region. I happen to live in a really interesting part of Seattle where I can kind of throw a rock and I can hit one county that's different than mine, and I can throw a rock in a different direction and hit another city. And so because of my area, I have different fire and different police and different ambulance come kind of depending on a few different factors. And it's the public safety access point that's responsible for that. So unfortunately, they don't have a lot of opportunity to interact with a caller and try to find out, are you in Shoreline, Washington? Are you in Lake Forest Park, Washington? Or are you in Mount Lake Terrace, Washington? But the contact center that Microsoft will send that call to first, if location isn't well understood, they do, and they will be able to determine what's the appropriate public safety access point for that to be distributed to. And I know this sounds complicated, and I know that there's a lot of detail in here, but we do document all of this for administrators in our emergency services documentation. And so you can see kind of precisely depending upon the type of location that the client acquires, depending upon what state that's in, then we'll whether or not we forward that call directly to the PSAP or we have that call be treated by the ECRC first.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. We also have another question. How is it different from third-party applications like Red Sky? How do you explain the team's role here?
Red Sky from oh, go ahead, Jamie.
Oh, no, go, you're good.
Okay, Red Sky from, maybe you can jump in. Red Sky, from my understanding, gives a more granular like location for the end user that is built on top of Teams location services. So if you want that more granular level of location, Red Sky provides that for you, but Teams is the actual mechanism still that actually places that outbound going call.
A lot of customers use Red Sky for a capability called an information service or a LIS. So if for telephony implementers kind of broadly, a LIS is a common component that's used for dynamic emergency calling. Microsoft includes a LIS as part of its default Teams phone capabilities. And that's the service that has all of the locations that your users are going to be in, and also has the components around how to map that to your network. So that way, when a client shows up in your network and it goes and it gets an IP address from a wireless access point or from your network infrastructure, that information can be used to determine where the caller is. So for customers that already have Red Sky or some other list, they can certainly integrate that. But that is something that's kind of by default Microsoft provides within our Teams Phone subscription.
Awesome. One more question. Does this work only when Microsoft calling plans are used? If we are using direct routing, this would not work? Or would
No,
this not
when
work?
you're using direct routing, you absolutely have the ability to configure all of the same things. The mechanisms are different though, and direct routing is designed to be much more flexible for customers to provide a wide range of dynamic emergency calling capabilities. So for some customers, they're just kind of using direct routing for connecting behind another PBX system or doing things like extension dialing. And there you're not going to have kind of the same rigorous set of requirements around having emergency addresses and so forth as with calling plans. But you absolutely have the ability to configure emergency calling on Operator Connect, direct routing, and calling plans. And we actually have unique documentation for each of those in our doc set. So you can go through and you can go through the specific information that's necessary around how to configure call routing for DR.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. And at the end, we do have a slide with all of the links gathered together. So we'll share that at the end so you can click on it directly. And we will share them in the chat at the end as well. Okay, thanks, Margie, for bringing those questions up. I'm going to pivot back to the rest of the list. And I want to thank folks as well. We had put in a call for questions a week or two ago. And so we've feathered those in. So appreciate folks taking the time to submit their questions ahead of time. Okay, so let's shift. We've talked a lot about the decisions that need to be made, but we wanted to give a quick view as well of the admin center. And so if we talk about some of the decisions that have to be made early on, what are some of the specific decisions that an admin needs to make when they're going in to set up emergency calling for the first time?
From my perspective, I think the biggest thing that customers need to think about is whether or not they want to configure dynamic emergency calling or whether they're looking to configure a static setup. And there's no right or wrong answer here. This really is going to depend upon the type of organization that you are, how many sites you have, what your users are doing, that sort of thing. What you see here shown on the screen with Teams Admin Center is the configuration of the policy that would be one of the policies that would be applied to an end user. And here you're choosing whether or not you want to allow first in the external location lookup mode, whether you want to have the client be able to on its own be able to look up location information. So if a user's working at a coffee shop, then they can still be supported for dynamic emergency calling. And then the second section below, you see there's a whole variety of different phone numbers that you can have as emergency dial strings. And so if you have a population of users, for example, that will transit between Europe and the US, maybe they have a habit in Europe to dial 112 or dial 999. You can configure the system to be able to accept those numbers as well as emergency calls, and have them translate those numbers appropriately when they're traveling in the U.S. And so again, just a whole lot of flexibility here. But going back to the kind of key question, Emily, that you asked, it really is around whether or not you want to have a dynamic capability. So as a user moves around to the corporate network and they're connecting to different network resources, those network resources are associated with a physical address. And so if I'm at Microsoft, for example, I show up in building 30, and I'm hanging out in the building 30 lobby, my client knows that I'm there because I'm connected to that wireless access point. And then when I go and I have lunch in the cafe next door, I'm connected to a different wireless access point that's associated with a different address. And so if I need to dial emergency services from there, they're not going to come to my office. They're going to come to where I'm physically located. And that dynamic nature of location acquisition is probably the biggest question that customers have to determine how they want to move forward with setting this up.
Okay, yeah, and so kind of continuing there, what are some of the pitfalls that you see in that setup once those decisions are made?
Yeah, probably the biggest one is around not thinking about the kind of manageability and the end-to-end maintenance of these kind of configurations, because what ends up happening fundamentally is that the corporate network is getting modeled within teams. And so if the corporate network ends up changing, then the model within Teams, what you're configuring within Teams Admin Center also needs to change. And that could be just something as simple as, that somebody broke the wireless access point in the cafe as they were hanging streamers up for the party. Somebody knocked the ladder into the wireless access point, it fell. Okay, no big deal. We've got tons of wireless access points, back in our storehouse. But if you're not updating that information in Teams, then you're not going to have that location acquisition happen. And so that really turns into an operational kind of conversation within IT. So how to understand that as the network team is making changes to the way that things are configured, that those changes are being made within the location infrastructure that Teams maintains.
Okay, yeah, so things sometimes out of our control that need to be taken into account. Yeah, the inevitable. So let's move. We've talked quite a bit about the admin, and I do want to make sure that we talk about the user's experience, right? They're the ones who are going to be needing to make those decisions in real time. So can you walk us through a little bit what happens in that call end to end? So if I'm a user and there's something that is needing me to make that decision to dial emergency services, what will that look like?
Yeah, so when a user dials 911 or their emergency number on the dial pad, there are actually a few things that are happening behind the scenes. One is obviously the location lookup. So team is querying for the location depending on if they're in the office or if they're at a remote location or at home. So based on their configuration, obviously Teams has to look up the location of the actual user in accordance with also a policy check. Teams has to check if the emergency calling policy is actually configured for the end user, and if there needs to be a security desk or a notification group that has to be alerted in accordance with that emergency call, because then those people are going to be able to help and give a hand in that emergency situation. Then there's all the call routing that goes on behind the scenes as well. So if there's like the PSAP location has to get sent through, and this is kind of where Jamie was mentioning earlier, if you have something like Red Sky, they will kind of hand it off from the PSAP, but then obviously Teams has to actually deliver the location to the PSAP so that they're informed of where the end user actually is. And on the client experience, in the UX, actually, the user in the calls app can always see their location or manually verify it at the very bottom left-hand corner. And when the user actually dials and places that emergency call, the UX looks different than a normal phone call. There's like more like red flashing sirens, like not flashing sirens, but it's a different UX to indicate that this person is truly in an emergency. And you'll be able to also see if there is, that security desk notification.
I think it goes
Okay,
back
so
to your
that
point earlier, Emily. Like you were kind of talking about some of the UX implications around the client. Like this isn't something that end users can practice, right?
right. Yeah, and that's something a lot of times, when we're talking about phone and even meetings, there's the test call that people do, or setting up like a webinar, like we're doing today. You have a dry run, and but emergency calls don't have that same opportunity. And even if they do, it's not something that people may think about. So it is really important that we make the decisions that we have, and that we continue to evolve to make sure that in those moments and those times of need, people can get what they need.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, exactly.
Let's talk a bit about location. That's something that's come up quite a bit as well, in the questions in the form ahead of time. So that does seem to be one of the core challenges. So Jamie, could you tell us a little bit about how the BSSID and the location verification works, for folks who may not be aware of that?
Yeah, definitely. So the BSSID piece, that really comes from setting up dynamic emergency calling for an organization. And so there are really three main ways that teams can determine where a client is located within the corporate network. So within the corporate network, I can use the unique radio identifier of my wireless access point. That's called a BSSID. It can use the subnet information that comes from the network, or it can use the LLDP, a layer 2 protocol, to determine what switch or what port it's plugged into. So a lot of times, customers that are used to setting that up with hard phones, with IP phones, and so any of those three different types of information can be configured within Teams and then used to map that network information to a location. And that location can be as granular as you want or need to set. So that could be anything from I'm on the 3rd floor of building 30 to I'm in the northwest quadrant of the warehouse, right? Like, depending upon what your requirements are as an organization and where you're physically located.
That's great. One thing, when we talk about global organizations, how does that translate? And users are making these verifications for global, are there different considerations admins would need to make in that case?
So I was referring to the admin configured pieces. So an admin configuring teams to be able to understand where a user is on the network. What we're showing here within the screen share, the user location consent, this is around a scenario where an end user is located off of the corporate network. So instead of being in building 30, I'm hanging out at my favorite coffee shop. And if Teams is allowed to get the information from the operating system about location, then we can use that information to go and look up against public services to be able to determine where someone's physically located. I know, Mariana, this is one of the kind of a little bit more one of the recent features that that Teams and Windows have come out with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of better helps end users to decide if they want to directly consent or not consent to that external lookup mode. So this would only apply when the user is at a remote location and they're not located physically on campus.
Okay, yeah, and I think, especially, well, a few years ago, but now still that's something that's much more common than, let's say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we live in a world where you don't know where people are working. So having that, being able to support that remote location and know where the user is really important.
I think it's also great that the client has done the work to ensure that regardless of whether you as an end user are working from your home office, whether working from another remote location or working from the corporate office, that location experience operates the same way. And so like I don't have to go to one place within Teams to find a location if I'm working at my coffee shop versus another time to look and see if it's picked up my office correctly. All of that shows up in the same way in the client. So it's pretty intuitive for end users to be able to understand and figure out.
Good, and that's what's most important for sure. I see there's a few questions in the chat. Let's take a quick pivot and take some of the questions that have just come in.
All right. Thank you, Emily. I'll go ahead and read some of these questions. So we have a question. What happens for users who are on Starlink and happen to have location data very obscured versus actual location?
Starlink's interesting. So clearly, Starlink is not going to be set up as a location within your corporate network, right? You don't have Starlink like extending your WAN or extending your local network. It's going to fundamentally look to the team services like the end user is located off of the corporate environment. And so there, it's going to attempt to resolve location in the same way that it would if I was connecting through public Wi-Fi in another area. Windows has a variety of ways to figure that out, depending upon whether or not the endpoint has GPS capability, whether or not we can do a geo-IP lookup based on the IP address that comes from Starlink. But clearly that it's not going to be as accurate, right? And so in any of those cases, we're going to, when somebody dials emergency services, we're going to route that call to the emergency call handling center, and a human's going to come on the line, going to interact with the caller and make sure that we know where they physically are located before dispatching out to the PSAP.
Awesome, thanks. Another question we have is, what about remote work where staff splits time in and out of office on VPN? Microsoft location puts them anywhere but their address when working from home.
If the question's about VPN capability, that is definitely one that we've heard from a lot of customers. And there's a whole variety of different scenarios that involve VPNs. And in some of these cases, this can actually extend into scenarios where customers are running cloud-based firewalls on their network. But we're seeing more and more scenarios where VPNs are required, even when a customer an end user is on their corporate network. These kind of zero trust Wi-Fi scenarios are kind of what we talk about. Don't have anything to announce today because this is a public webinar, but definitely know that we have the scenario very well understood, and we look forward to being able to say more in the near future.
Great. Next question is, we are a global distributed company, also present in the US, and have just set up the first US location with E911 with direct routing. Is the usage location attribute from the Entra ID user object and maybe also from the attendant resource account in a shared calling scenario relevant for the call to automatically select the right Azure region for the outgoing emergency call?
We don't select Azure regions for the outbound call. So that's handled in a different manner from the service, and that's not necessarily something that's controlled by admins, even in a direct routing scenario. In direct routing, your calls are going to be managed based on how you route out to your gateways. Generally, those are session border controllers, and so that's what's going to determine your routing. So you can have emergency calls only go out through one set of gateways or one set of resources. You can have them be distributed across. There are reasons to do both depending upon how the calls are routed as they egress teams.
Right. All right. So I think we have some time for one more question. Last one. How can we validate our team's E911 configuration and confirm that emergency calls are correctly routed to the appropriate PSAP with the correct location information? What are the components?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. What are the components needed to define in TAC for calling plan users? How is the priority going when matching the information in TAC?
Argy, I apologize for interrupting the totality of your question. I got really excited because we hadn't had the opportunity to say that 933 is a service that's available to administrators to be able to test your end-to-end emergency calling setup, and it works really great. The whole way that this is set up is that it will have the client pretend that it's doing an emergency call. It will go to a service that will read the location information that gets sent back to you. So you get a really good sense of whether or not everything is working end to end. It's definitely a best practice for administrators to be able to configure and set that up. Yeah, fantastic.
Awesome, thank you, Emily. I'll hand it back over to you.
Sure. Okay, we have a few minutes left, so I'll start wrapping things down here. I think we've covered a lot of ground, but Jamie and Mar, if there was one thing you could leave folks with that you know, whether it's a best practice, something that you wish everyone understood about emergency calling, what would that be?
I'll start, and then
thoughts.
I'll let Mar wrap us up here. But
Okay.
From my perspective on the services front, definitely have a look at your network, and if you have an opportunity to do some network remediation, if you have some opportunity to clean up some things in your network that you have always wanted to do but have never had the opportunity, take the opportunity with dynamic emergency calling. Having overlapping subnets, having not a good process around wireless access point naming and conventions and things like that are really important to address now. Having a quote unquote messy corporate network means that the configuration is going to be more strenuous within teams, and then you're operationally are going to be kind of chasing that for a while. So customers that have had the most success in rolling this out have taken the opportunity to think deeply about their corporate network first, make changes that they need to make, and then move forward with implementation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super important. And a question that we actually get asked quite often as well. So thanks for bringing that up, Jamie. On my front, I think it's honestly about more user education and having your end users actually know that they can dial emergency services within Teams. When I joined Microsoft Teams, I didn't even know that that was a thing. So just being able to surface that, and we have the proper user experience within the calls app where admins can relay that information that end users need to configure and are responsible if they need to manually verify their location as well, like through the admin verification banner. They see their location at the bottom in the calls app as well. So just bringing more awareness that if a user is truly in an emergency, that they are allowed to dial 911 via Teams and that it's supported.
That's great. I think, a key theme is just the preparedness aspect, both from awareness, everything, obviously from the setup. And so I do see, thank you, Margie, for sharing those resource links in the chat. There's, I believe, 4 of them. So the links on the slide here are the ones you can access them directly there. And
one
we
more
are always open to feedback. So please take a look. And if there's any questions that you like to have answered that aren't there, let us know. We are the folks who can help make those changes happen. So go ahead, Mar.
I was just going to say, if you need any more specific documentation on how to configure emergency services for Operator Connect, direct routing, or calling plans, those are under those fields under Microsoft .learn under those support those support files in the documentation.
Great. Thank you, Mar. All right, with that, that brings us to the end. I want to thank both Jamie and Mar for your time today going through emergency services. And for everybody here, thank you for joining. For folks catching the recording, thank you for listening in. Here are the links to connect with the community. We have the channel that you can join. We also have the YouTube channel where all of these recordings are posted after the fact. We will do our best to go through the questions. I know there were a few that we weren't able to get to, and we will post the answers in the channel once we're able to get all of the resources together after today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.